Hey, I'm Daniel and welcome back to another Elder Scrolls Betrayal of the Second Era video. Today we're going over every single non-quest enemy skill in the game, that's 29 in total, as well as the 6 native effects tied to specific provinces. I'll explain how each one works and share some tips and strategies for dealing with them. Let's go. Alright, let's go alphabetically, starting with Aggressive, which says after rolling enemy combat dice, this unit rerolls all misses one time before dealing damage to its target. And the way it works is pretty simple. Let's say enemy rolls 3 combat dice, and this is the result they get. 1 damage and 2 misses. Because they have aggressive, they can reroll all misses, so this result we kinda set aside and we can reroll those misses before they deal damage. So yeah, we've got number 2 and number 1. And this is what makes them pretty scary sometimes. As you can probably tell, most of these enemies, they are melee enemies, with some exceptions, but even those range 2 or 3 is kinda still considered pretty close range. So you can, if you want to, keep them around on the battlefield, you know, kiting them around, or maybe in a delve you can potentially run away from them. But my advice would be not to keep them away for too long, because at some point, inevitably, with all these revels, you might see those scary numbers of 3 times 2, which might just instantly teleport you to the nearest town. If you have some ability to reroll enemy combat dice, for example, if you're playing a bard or a rogue, you can wait for them to reroll their misses first and then choose to reroll the dice. For example, if we're playing a rogue, we can use our ability to reroll all the scary looking results for hopefully something better. And let's say for demonstration purposes, let's see if they miss, those enemies, they won't be able to reroll this again, so the infinite loop not gonna happen, thankfully, because they can reroll it only 1 time. Now, important rule to keep in mind when it comes to how the targeting works in this game. Let's say we have the Gentleman Ogre that can target 2 enemies within its range, and let's say if it can hit 2 targets, you're still gonna roll the dice only once for all target at once, which is pretty different from the way how sometimes targeting works in some other games, for example in Gloomhaven. And for us as a Gloomhaven veterans, it was a little bit unusual at first, but yeah, in this game, in the Elder Scrolls Betrayal of the Second Era, you roll all the dice at once, even if it hit multiple targets. So overall, when it comes to those aggressive enemies, I would say they are not a big threat in general. However, try not to keep them around for too long, because otherwise you might see those scary critical numbers. Next we have Arcane. The damage dealt by this unit is true damage, and true damage essentially bypasses all the shields and blocks and other abilities that normally prevent damage, unless it specifically says that it can prevent also true damage as well. That means that the heavy armor dice, not gonna help against true damage. Expert evasion, not gonna help against true damage. Your racial abilities like Argonian resistance, not gonna help. And even your bonus health that you normally keep on your racial sheet as well, not gonna help against true damage. And the only thing that can prevent true damage, at least as far as I remember, is this level 3 die from the light armor skill line called Annulment. And also keep in mind that some abilities that give you extra health that can exceed your health stat can help to mitigate this true damage a little bit as well. For example, if we have the sorcerers and their ability Dark Exchange can moves the health chips not as bonus health, but as a just basically normal health that goes under their health, just like so. This health can help you to mitigate this true damage as well. There are currently only 3 enemies in the game with this particular skill, but I would say they all pretty dangerous, not only because of the Arcane, because they deal true damage, but also because of the combination with other skills they have, and also because of their range. So honestly, my best piece of advice how to deal with those enemies, just make them your priority targets and try to eliminate them as quick as you can, because otherwise they are very dangerous. Next we have Bane. After this unit's engage, apply a Bane status die to this unit's target. So Bane is a status die with this symbol, and just like all status dies, they go to your cooldown track, and while this die in your cooldown track, you take in 1 true damage at the beginning of every of your turn. And keep in mind that this damage takes place before your recovery step. So let's say we have this wood elf, and let's just, for the sake of demonstration, let's pretend that this is our cooldown track. It's kind of in the same order, and this is now the adventurer's turn, but before they would recover all those leftmost dice, they first will take 1 true damage because of Bane, and only then it will be removed. So it's pretty dangerous if you can let it sit for quite a long time. Maybe if you have busy cooldown and you get this to the very top rightmost position, so it's gonna sit there potentially for a few turns, dealing you 1 true damage every single turn. So yeah, pretty dangerous. The question you might have is what happens when you already have a Bane status die in your cooldown track and the enemy applies it again, and that particularly with this Spriggan enemy, because as you can tell, it doesn't have any combat dice. His combat stat is equal 0, which means it doesn't even roll any dice. The only thing it does, it applies Bane. And so let's say we have this Spriggan enemy, and let's say we have another adventurer just standing a couple of hexes away. This Wood Elf already has a Bane in their cooldown track. How the Spriggan would behave? Would it go to another adventurer applying Bane to them? And the answer is no. It simply will continue applying Bane, and so in this particular case, this Bane will just simply switch back to the top rightmost position of the cooldown track of Wood Elf, and this will kind of continue happening every turn, just gonna keep refresh it and refresh it and refresh it every turn. And while it's only a single bit of damage, keep in mind that it's a true damage, and also remember that you don't normally remove the status die from your cooldown track at the end of battle, which means if you ended a battle with this Bane sitting in your cooldown track, that means you start your next battle with the same status die as well, of course, unless you remove it with your adventurer rest step, or unless you visit a town and spend the town action on the inn. So overall, I would say those Bane enemies are maybe not the most priority targets overall, of course depending on some other enemies around, but generally speaking they are pretty nasty, because this single bit of damage, it can add up pretty quickly, so try to defeat them as quick as you can. Next we have Chilblain. After this unit is engaged by an adventurer who is not using a weapon, that adventurer gains a light fatigue equal to party size. And this is a bit tricky one, so let's unwrap this. First of all, even though the term party usually includes all companions and other allies on your side, in this particular case it only refers to the number of adventurers. So if you are playing solo as a single adventurer and you engage those Chilblain enemies, and if you are not using a weapon, then you gain 1 light fatigue. Whereas for the same case, if you're playing with 4 players, you would gain 4 light fatigue. And just taking this opportunity, I just want to share how much I appreciate the design of scalable enemy power. I think this is brilliant. I wish more enemy skills they can scale with the number of adventurers in play, because generally speaking, when you're playing with multiple adventurers, especially up to 4, the game tends to get slightly easier compared to if you're playing solo, so this way it can balance its scales. Yeah, I think it's brilliant by design, and I wish more enemy power will scale in a similar way. But now let's clarify what is using a weapon or not using a weapon actually means. So let's say we have this Wood Elf archer engaging those enemies using the bow skill line roll and snipe die, and this is the weapon they have, the wood steel axe. Would this count as using a weapon for the purpose of avoiding taking light fatigue from this engage? And the answer is no, simply because this axe requires a heavy weapon battle form, whereas rolling snipe dice from the bow skill line requires adventurers to be in ranged battle form. So in this particular case, even though this axe might be sitting in the ready slots of the adventurers, they is not considered as using a weapon, and hence why this Wood Elf archer would gain a light fatigue after this engage. Now let's say instead of this void steel axe, our adventurer is using Nightwood bow, but to spice things up a bit, let's say they roll in this snipe dice along this combat skill die, whereas the effect of this item says for this engage, if it includes no combat skill dice, increase your range by 2. But in this case we are using combat dice, so how this would affect the Chilblain enemy skill? And the good news is for our adventurers that in that case it is considered as using a weapon, even though they don't get the benefit of this weapon particular effect. So essentially, as long as you have a weapon in your ready slot and the battle form required for using a weapon is matching for the battle form of your engage, which in this case is a ranged weapon for the snipe die and a ranged weapon for this bow, so it matches, so it is considered as using a weapon, even though you're not necessarily gaining any benefits from this effect. Overall, I would say that Chilblain enemies are pretty dangerous, not only because of this skill itself, but also because of the combination with other skills and their stats. As you can tell, especially for level 20 enemies, they are pretty scary looking, so yeah, I would probably make them a high priority targets if you can. Moving on, we have Colossal. This unit deploys with additional health equal to the total number of combat skill dice trained by adventurers. I think there are 2 specific words that need some clarification, which are combat and trained. And first of all, combat skill dice are referred to these white dice that each adventurer starts with, and only them specifically. I've read some messages from beginner players thinking that combat skill dice would include all dice that deal damage, but yeah, it kind of makes sense to think about it this way. And also the word trained includes all combat skill dice your adventurer has, whether it's from beginning of your character creation, or some skill dice that you extra trained along the way, or some dice that are drained or sit in your cooldown track, doesn't matter where they are in your adventure map, as long as you have any number of these skill dice, this Colossal effect takes place. And so all those Colossal enemies, they would deploy with additional health equal to the collective number of combat dice from all of your adventurers. So if you are playing with 4 adventurers and some of you maybe train some extra combat skill dice, that might get a little bit spicy. Some of these enemies might have 10 extra health, and extra it means it goes beyond those printed values. So let's say this Bone Colossus, it starts with 4 health, but it gains extra health depending on the number of those combat skill dice. So overall, I think those Colossal enemies, they're probably not the worst in the game. There are some more dangerous skills in particular. However, I should probably point out that this particular one, Breathing Usurper, might get pretty tricky because of the combination with Stalwart, which we're going to talk about later in this video. So yeah, just be mindful about this particular folk, but yeah, other than that, I think Colossal is pretty manageable. Next we have Daze. After this units engage, apply a Daze status die to this unit's target. And the way it works is the following. Let's say this Banekin engages our Orc adventurer and they apply this Daze status die. And because we have Daze, we can essentially either move or roll the die, but not both. So if we roll the die, we can't move, or if we move, then we can't roll the die anymore for this particular turn. And unlike other status die, Daze only works for a single turn, so at the end of the turn it's removed. I would say this is a pretty dangerous enemy skill, because let's say this adventurer is a melee character, so they need to move in order to engage and attack these enemies, and let's say they are moving, but because they move, they can't roll their melee combat dice anymore. So yeah, this is a kind of essentially you skip turn in a way, which is really nasty. I would say that for ranged characters it's slightly less dangerous. Let's say if this Orc, it has a bow skill line, they could potentially just shoot from the same hex without even the need of moving, and so the kind of Daze effect doesn't do anything on its own. However, it can be pretty dangerous in combination with the blind effect in particular. I would say those dazing enemies definitely should be your priority targets, not only because of the Daze effect itself, but also just look at them. Most of them roll in 3 or 4 combat dice, and we have Dreamora again coming back with the arcane damage here. Really strong enemies. Make them your high priority and try to defeat them, hopefully before they can engage you for the first time. Next we have Decay. At the end of this unit's turn, it is dealt 1 true damage. Now if you are not a native English speaker, just like me, those words that can be sometimes a little bit tricky, but basically those enemies, they are not dealing extra damage, they are essentially dealing 1 true damage to themselves. I think it's pretty cool that all those enemies, they are Daedra type of enemies, so kind of magic creatures, and they can essentially fade in away into the existence. I just love the way this works thematically. But yeah, I have done much to say about this ability. It's basically a little extra help for our adventurers, because those monsters, those enemies, they just taking extra damage to themselves. However, keep in mind that all those enemies, they are dealt 1 true damage at the end of the turn. So let's say if we have this Wisp sitting with the last health chip, they would first activate as normal, they will deal some damage, rolling 2 combat die, or maybe moving towards the target, depending on their position of course, but only after that they would dealt 1 true damage to themselves, effectively just defeating themselves. Next we have Detection. This unit ignores stealth status dice when targeting. It works pretty simple. Let's say we have this Wood Elf Archer sitting in stealth, hoping to get away with this, but no, all those gentlemen, they can see through and target those Wood Elf Archer as normal. However, keep in mind that only those enemies can kind of see through your stealth and can ignore this. Let's say if you have another enemy, let's say this Ogre, and they will not see through your detection. So it's not like you're not losing stealth, you're not, those detection enemies, they're not making alarm, making all other enemies seeing through. It just them can target you, but other enemies still cannot. And maybe taking this opportunity, I would also like to add how normal enemies, non-detection enemies, behave when you have a stealth status die in your cooldown track, particularly when you're playing in solo. Let's take this Ogre as an example. It doesn't have the detection skill, which means they can't kind of see through your stealth, they can't ignore it. However, if you are the only target, if you are the only adventurer in play sitting in stealth, they're gonna still move towards the valid hex where they would normally attack from. Of course, they would still not attack because they can't target stealth units, however, they will still move towards the closest hex where they can potentially attack from. Maybe they hear some noise, maybe they can hear some smell, it's up to your imagination, but yeah, that's the biggest distinction than when you're playing solo, so when non-detection enemies, they can still move even when you are in stealth. But all those gentlemen with the detection skill, they can just completely ignore your stealth and just shoot or attack as normal. I would say that detection is, generally speaking, not a big problem, of course, unless you're playing crazy stealth shenanigan build, but yeah, generally speaking, they are not a big threat when it comes to this particular skill, but the enemies themselves with the skill are pretty dangerous. I think this Nyx Hound pack is the only single enemy in the game that roll 5 combat dice, which is just huge, and of course this Wood Elf Deadeye rolling 4 combat dice from the range of 6 is just huge. So while detection might be not the most top priority, be mindful that those enemies they can still hit pretty hard. Next we have Disrupt. When this unit determines a target, its target must exhaust 1 die from its active slots if possible. This is referred to all those dice that are normally sitting in your active slots, like the one from the One-Handed Shield or Restoring Light or Bow or Light Armor skill lines and others. And the important part of this Disrupt effect in its timing, which says when this unit determines a target. So let's say if you have this One-Handed Shield sitting in your active slot, which normally you can use to prevent 1 damage, but as soon as those enemies they target you with this die sitting in your active slot, it kind of kicks them out instantly even without you taking a chance to block this damage. I would say that this is a pretty nasty effect, especially for all One-Handed Shield and Light Armor users, because not only you're losing the beneficial effects of those dice providing while they're sitting in your active slots, that means you also need to roll them again, and that's another engage, another die in your cooldown track. Yeah, pretty nasty stuff. But at the same time, if you're using any other build or skill dice that not necessarily sitting in your active slots, then this Disrupt effect kinda does nothing to you. So in that sense, I would say that Disrupt enemies are not necessarily priority targets for me usually, but just be mindful if you're using One-Handed Shield or Light Armor and you heavily rely on using some combo with those skills, yeah, just be mindful. Maybe in that case, I would probably focus on them first. Coming up next, we have Divert. This unit cannot lose its last health unless it is already at 1 health prior to taking damage. I know this might be a little bit confusing, so let me explain how it works very simply. Let's take this Dark Elf Sentry as an example. They have 8 health, no defense, so that means that normally 8 damage would be enough to defeat this enemy, but let's say if you are dealing even 10 or 20 damage, this enemy would be like, nope, I'm still here sitting with the last health chip, so unless you deal in any kind of extra damage using some other effects or you taking another engage, you won't be able to defeat this enemy with a single engage. So essentially this prevents you from one-shotting enemies, and I must say that I love it. I wish there would be more effects that would kind of prevent doing that in one way or another, but yeah, I think this Divert implementation is very clever. It makes all these enemies a little bit more challenging, a little bit more kind of strategic, because you need to think what maybe you need to make another engage or find some extra source of damage in order to defeat them. There is one particularly dangerous combo, and that is when Divert is combined with Recover, and even though we're going to talk about Recover in detail later in this video, it's essentially those enemies they recover some health at the end of the turn. So as you can imagine, if you're making 1 engage and you're leaving with those enemies with a single health, then if you not finish them off within your turn, they will regain extra health at the end of their turn, and then you need to make another engage to bring them down to 1 health first before you can finish with another engage or another source of damage. So I would say that those particular enemies like Dark Elf Sentry or Skeleton Mage or Hollow Guardian, because they combine Divert with Recover, they are definitely priority targets. Generally speaking, I would say your class abilities are your best friends when it comes to dealing with these Divert enemies. I think pretty much every, or at least most classes, have some kind of class abilities for maybe 1 or 2 tenacity that normally deals just a little bit of damage, which, you know, slightly towards the late game can becomes less effective because it's not true damage, and so it's generally speaking not very effective against high defense enemies. But against those Divert enemies, when you know, just need to deal 1 bit of damage, this can be a huge help. Next we have Dodge. When this unit is engaged by an opposing unit, prevent damage dealt to this unit equal to the number of rolled dice that do not deal damage. And I know this is another pretty confusing one, so let me explain. Let's say we are engaging targeting this High Elf Marauder, and this is the result that we get using our combat dice. We'll get 1 damage and 1 miss, and normally that would still count as 1 damage. But because this High Elf Marauder has dodge, we're essentially treating every miss as extra defense, kinda another way to frame it. And because we rolled miss, we're essentially treating this High Elf Marauder as having 1 defense, which means this 1 damage will not go through and it will not take any damage. I think it's pretty obvious when you're rolling your miss result on your damage dealing dice, you're essentially treating every miss as a essentially extra defense on that enemy, but things get a little bit more interesting when you're adding other dice with the same engage. Let's say as a part of the same engage, we also roll 1 die from the acrobatic skill line, and let's say this result was with the number 2, how that would go. And well, because we rolled 1 miss, that means High Elf Marauder would prevent 1 damage. However, because we also rolled this acrobatic skill line, and even though it's not a miss, this die doesn't deal damage, so in this case High Elf Marauder would prevent 2 damage. And even though we rolled 2 on this particular die, because other 2 dice they don't deal any damage, that means this High Elf Marauder prevents both of the damage dealt, and this means it doesn't take any damage. So I would say the best course of action against all those dodge enemies is simply don't roll all those kind of utility skill dice with the same engage, for example like this acrobatic skill die. And also keep in mind, if you choose not to resolve certain dice, even those are kind of damage dealing dice, that still counts towards this dodge ability. Let's say for this example, instead of the acrobatic skill die, we rolled two-handed skill die of level 2, this one on slot, and it landed on this particular side, which is drained after resolving. And of course remember that after rolling the die you can make a decision whether to resolve this die or not, with only a few exceptions in the game. But let's say in this particular case, if you chose not to resolve this particular die, it still counts essentially as miss for this dodge ability. So yeah, just be mindful about what dice you want to roll and even what dice you want to resolve as a part of this engage when you're targeting these dodge enemies. Next we have Elusive. This unit prevents all damage, including true damage, dealt by units that were not adjacent to it at the start of the current turn. And this is another pretty tricky one, so let me explain. Let's say this is our Wood Elf adventurer and they want to deal some damage to these elusive enemies, but all those enemies they will prevent that damage unless the adventurers start their turn adjacent to them. And so essentially what it means is that you need to allow those enemies to come to you first and therefore to hit you first before they can take some damage from you. And this of course gets even more tricky when you're dealing with the ranged elusive enemies like this little imp or harpy. So Elusive is a pretty nasty skill, but luckily there are at least 3 ways of how you can effectively counter it. And the first effective strategy how to counter elusive enemies is using this Fleet Phantom level 1 skill die from the acrobatic skill line. While this die sitting in your cooldown track, it gives you free movement at the start of your turn, and the important thing about this is the timing, which essentially happens before your turn. So let's say if we have this adventure on this slot and we have the Fleet Phantom sitting in our cooldown track, and so right before the adventurer's turn begins, they can move for free thanks to this die, essentially moving adjacent to this enemy, and now when the actual turn begins, they are already adjacent, so they can start dealing damage, and therefore these enemies will start taking damage. The second effective strategy how to deal with elusive enemy is by using some kind of instant defeating or removal effects, because this is not the same as dealing damage. As you might already guessed, I'm talking about the Executioner from the two-handed skill line, Destructive Touch from the Destruction Staff skill line, and Intimidating Presence from the Speech skill line. These particular dice completely bypass the elusive skill simply because they don't deal any damage strictly speaking, and so hence why elusive don't need to prevent damage again strictly speaking, because those enemies they just instantly defeated or removed from the game. And the third way how to counter elusive is by using some kind of effects that makes enemy lose health, which again is not the same as dealing damage or taking damage. The example of this might be a Sorcerer's Dark Exchange. Overall, I would say elusive enemies are pretty nasty, especially if you don't have this particular skill dice in your build, because it's very likely that those enemies will hit you at least once. Next we have Enfeeble. After this unit's engage, its target gains X light fatigue, with the X being the number printed on the particular enemy. Generally speaking, in this game, I would say mastering the management of your cooldown track is the most important thing on your adventurer mat, and it's especially true if you're playing on the expert difficulty, because when you're playing on expert, each additional engage, you need to add 2 light fatigue instead of just 1, which trust me makes quite a big difference. And so what these Enfeeble enemies do, they are essentially slowing you down. They limit the number of engages you can do per turn. And remember that if your cooldown track is already full and you're still gaining all those light fatigue because of the Enfeeble effect, it means you need to drain a bunch of all those other dice sitting in your cooldown track and replacing them with over fatigue. This can be just absolutely detrimental to the outcome of a combat. For this reason, I would say these Enfeeble enemies are probably one of the worst enemies in the game, and you should definitely make them your priority. Particularly the ranged one, especially this Orc Wizard. Ranged 8 is just huge and unlimited number of targets, and Enfeeble 3 or the Slimy Enfeeble 5 is just huge. It's almost a half of your entire cooldown track. With a range of 4, again unlimited targets, is just huge. Definitely make those enemies your top priority. Up next we have Ethereal. When this unit is dealt damage by an adventurer not in magic battle form, this unit prevents party size damage. Similar to Chilblain, the power of this effect scales with the number of adventurers in play. For example, if you are playing solo and you are targeting this wisp with any physical battle form, not in magic, it prevents only single damage, but if you're playing with 4 players and you don't have any magic users, it means this wisp would prevent 4 damage. Keep in mind that similar to dodge, the effect of Ethereal stacks with the normal enemy defense. For example, if you are playing with 4 adventurers and you're targeting this ghost, because they have 2 defense, and if you're playing with 4 players, it means they prevented 4 extra damage, so that means that essentially you can treat this ghost as having 6 defense, which is huge. Luckily, there are only 3 of these ethereal enemies currently in the game, and also luckily all of them have this Decay skill, which we already covered. I think it's like a little backup plan in case your party stack with completely no magic users whatsoever. At least those enemies will ultimately kind of fade away, dealing damage to themselves. But keep in mind that there are a couple of quests and encounters in the game where sometimes just normal regular enemies all of a sudden gain this ethereal skill as well. So really the best way to deal with ethereal enemies if you are playing with party is to make sure that at least one adventurer has the magic skill dice to roll against them. And if you have the Valenwood expansion, you can also train this enchant weapon skill die. I think it's fantastic. So overall, I think these are not the worst enemies in the game, but they can be a little bit problematic if you are not prepared. Moving on, next we have Intimidate. After this unit's engage, apply a fear status die to this unit's target. If the target already has a fear status die, remove it instead. So let's talk about how fear works. Let's say this is our adventurer and they got the fear status die in their cooldown track. And while we are feared, we ignore all non-combat skill dice, which essentially means that while we have this fear in our cooldown track, the only thing we can use are these white combat skill dice. And since we're talking about the fear status die, let me also quickly mention what happens when you apply them to enemies. So let's say we have this Nord Sword Master, and let's say we found a way to apply fear to them, and similar to how our feared adventurers can only use their basic combat dice, the same goes for the enemies. They can only roll their combat dice, in this case it will be black combat dice for them, but all their skills are ignored. So in this particular case, this Nord Sword Master, we can treat them as they don't have all this Intimidate and Native and other affixes, other skills if we apply them to all enemies. So you're essentially ignoring everything is below their name, all their skills, all their abilities, they can simply roll their combat dice and that's it. So as you can imagine, fear is a very powerful status die, both when applied to enemies and adventurers. Sometimes it can be absolutely devastating, especially if you are a heavy magic user, you can't roll your combat dice, perhaps you even untrained your combat dice, so you basically just can't do anything. But luckily for this Intimidate ability specifically, it says if the target already has fear in their cooldown track, you remove it instead. It's designed in a very clever way that can still provide some kind of backup option, so you wouldn't be locked in a particular battle without being able to do like anything, which slightly helps to mitigate this affix in a particular circumstances. So yeah, just kudos to the Chip Theory games for designing in such a clever way. It's kind of like in video games, sometimes when you're applying a crowd controlling effects, they have diminishing return. Well, maybe if you fear enemies or maybe if you stun enemies, the duration of those effects, they are decreasing over time, so you prevent complete stun lock or fear lock, and in a similar way it's designed here with this dice. I think it's very clever, and yeah, I like it. That being said, if those Intimidate enemies manage to apply fear at least once, you essentially skipping a turn, of course unless you have another way of removing status die, but yeah, if you don't have those options, it might be a Restoring Light or your Red Guard racial ability, all those kind of things that can remove status die. If you don't have those, then I would say Intimidate enemies should be your priority targets. They can be really hard to deal with, especially if there are maybe multiple of them. When you are one of them applying fear, then another removing, but on the next turn it's gonna go the other way around. So full circle, yeah, really strong. Moving on, we have Maim. After this unit's engage, apply a Maim status die to this unit's target. Similar to Daze and other status dies, these enemies they apply status die, but this time it's Maim, so let's talk about it. And the way it works is pretty simple, it just reduces the damage dealt by your combat skill dice by half, rounded down. And as we already established, combat skill dice are very specific dice your character has. For example, if this Wood Elf Archer would roll those two combat skill dice with the results of 1 and 1 while still being maimed, the total result will be simple 1, because 2 divided by half is 1. But if we roll only a single combat die, in this particular case the resulting damage would be 0, because Maim is not only reducing it by half but also rounding it down. So 1 divided by half is 0.5, rounding down is 0. But let's say if we roll the snipe dice alongside the combat dice, in this particular case the total damage would be 1, because these combat skill dice is reduced by half and rounded down 0, but still we're still dealing damage with the snipe die, thankfully, because Maim doesn't apply to that. Overall, unless you're going for a very specific combat heavy focused build, maybe with some synergistic items, or maybe if you're using your Nord's racial ability, adding enemy combat dice to your engage, then I would say this ability is not a big problem overall. Next we have Necromancy. At the end of this unit's turn, deploy the top unit of the defeated stack to the closest unoccupied hex to this unit with party size half. This new enemy does not take a turn this round. Remember that when you defeat enemies, they don't go back to the drawbacks where you pull them from, they go to a separate stack called defeated stack, which is very important for certain game effects, particularly for this Necromancy. So let's say if we have this a couple of enemies that we defeated before, they go to the defeated stack, and so those Necromancers, they can essentially resurrect all those enemies back into game, deploying them to the next adjacent hexes, depending on who resurrected them, with the health equal to the party size. I think this ability is fantastic, not only in its thematic design, in how all those Dark Lich and Archmages and Bone Lords enemies they resurrect in other allies, that's pretty cool, but also how it scales, so the enemies that's kind of brought back to life, they have a different amount of health depending on the party size, which scales, which I love this. As you can imagine, when more enemies brought back to life, it means we need more turns, more engages, and so this can go a little bit out of control if you're not taking care of those necromancy enemies first, but things can go absolutely wild if you have several of those necromancers in play, particularly kind of scattered across maybe different hexes, so you can't necessarily maybe finish them in one turn, but that means if you defeat one, then another one will resurrect that one, and that kind of like chain reaction, they resurrect other enemies, which is absolutely hilarious, but yeah, it can go absolutely out of control if you're not taking care of them quickly. Also, all of those necromancy enemies, they have a pretty long range 5, 6 or 7, so they can deal damage from a very far distance, especially in certain dungeons. So yeah, really dangerous enemies, and you should definitely prioritize in defeating them first. But keep in mind that if you have a companion with a necromancy skill, they will still resurrect enemies which will fight against you and not on your side, so those resurrected enemies, they won't become companions like the necromancer that you have on your side. Next we have Rally. After this unit is defeated, if it's not the last enemy in play, deploy an enemy of the next lowest level to the hex where this was defeated. Then return this unit to the enemy bag. So essentially, when you defeat those Rally enemies, you replace them with new enemies of the lowest level. So for example, if we have this Argonian enemy, because it has level 20, if we defeat this, we're gonna remove this one, and on the same hex we need to deploy another enemy of the next lowest level, which in this case it would be level 10. Just a new random enemy from the bag, and this Argonian enemy would go back to the bag. Sometimes, if you're lucky, or unlucky I guess, you can even pull a new enemy also with the rally skill, so sometimes it kind of gets a little like a chain reaction. You defeat one enemy with the rally, then you pull a random enemy from the bag and it also has the rally skill, so you're defeating that and you also pull in another one, so yeah, it can get a little bit out of control. Very rarely though, but still very possible. And yeah, as you can probably tell, there is one little caveat that this ability basically just doesn't trigger if this is last enemy in play. So honestly, the best strategy dealing with those rally enemies is simply try to keep them at last, defeat all other enemies in play, and this way you will not have other enemies added to the game. Though of course sometimes it's not worth it, again it depends on what other enemies in play, but you just pay attention if there is a last enemy or not. Of course, sometimes it gets a little tricky when you combine those rally skills with some others. For example, we have this Richman, which combines rally, which means you would ideally want to defeat it last, but they also have the necromancy skill, which generally speaking you want to prioritize first, because otherwise they will keep resurrecting their allies and more enemies will come in play. So yeah, I think in this particular case it's best maybe to defeat it first, even though it will replace them with another level 5 instead. But I think in this case it would be worth the trade-off, because otherwise I would be defeating everyone else around. So yeah, just one thing to keep in mind. Yeah, I think the way you prioritize them, just see what other skills are combined with this rally, and yeah, if it's not maybe something too horrible, then try to keep them until you defeat all other enemies around. But if it's something like this necromancy, definitely prioritize this first despite rally. Next we have Recover. At the start of this unit's turn, it heals for party size half. So we already briefly talked about recover when we was talking about the divert skill. Yeah, I think this particular combination is very dangerous, especially if you don't have enough damage or ways to quickly get rid of the divert enemies. They will recover, which means you would need another engage and then in other ways of dealing damage, which means either another engage or in other ways of using your class abilities or some other effects. Yes, pretty dangerous. And also combined with Ethereal, I believe Wisp Mother is probably the only Ethereal enemy who doesn't have Decay, so they don't go naturally kind of fading into existence unlike other Ethereal enemies, but instead of Decay, we have Recover, which kind of goes the other way around. Yeah, it's just very, very dangerous. And even though I don't think recovery should be as a top priority as some other skills, for example like Arcane or Necromancy or some others, I think you still need to make sure you have enough damage, so you need to ideally defeat all those recover enemies before all of your skills are on cooldown, because otherwise you can't just chip away their health, you know, one or two. You need to ideally defeat them in one big burst. Of course, except for those divert enemies, because you can't one-shot them, you still need other ways of dealing one extra bit of damage, but yeah, just keep in mind that you should probably prioritize them if you can, unless there are some other, even more dangerous enemies, but yeah, just keep in mind that you need quite a big chunk of damage, ideally, to defeat them in one go, if you can, because otherwise they will recover all the little bit of damage that you dealt. Moving on, next we have Retreat. At the end of this unit's turn, if no units took damage this turn, this unit gains a stealth status die and heals for 1 health. I think this ability is pretty simple, with the only caveat that in this game there is a difference between the damage that you are dealing and it's not necessarily the same damage that the unit is taking, so there is a difference in that and mechanically, and it's important for certain abilities like this one. For example, we have this Khajiit Marauder, and let's say they attack in this Argonian Adventurer, and maybe because this Khajiit Marauder rolls these scary looking numbers 2 and 2 for damage, the player chose not to take this damage and instead use their Argonian Resistance racial ability. So in this particular case, despite the fact that Khajiit Marauder dealt 4 damage, no one took damage this turn, and this is what it matters for the purpose of this ability, and so in this particular case, Khajiit Marauder would go to stealth and they would heal for 1 health as well. Overall, I would say this is probably the least dangerous ability in the game, maybe alongside Maim. Yeah, I don't think they are a big threat. Maybe with the only exception of Khajiit Cutthroat, but that is purely because they roll in 3 dice. That's the only reason. Frankly, I don't think this particular enemy skill Retreat provide any threat on the game. And the same is true, of course, for other melee units as well. Let's say if this Khajiit Cutthroat, they want to reach out this Argonian Adventurer, they would move 2 steps, something like that perhaps, and because no one took damage on their turn, they would gain stealth as well. In general, I would say this Retreat and this stealth mechanic is kind of similar to Elusive skill, in a way that if those enemies they kind of far away, maybe you not necessarily can reach them right away, it means they're moving to you, towards you, like this Khajiit Cutthroat, and because no one took damage, it means they get in stealth, and this way the next turn, it's very likely that they will strike you first before you have a chance to deal with them first. But other than that, I would say that Retreat is a pretty harmless ability overall, maybe similar to Maim. It's definitely not as dangerous as Enfeeble or some other really nasty affixes. This one is pretty manageable overall. Next we have Riposte, which says each turn, the first time this unit is dealt damage by an adjacent opposing unit, this unit will then deal damage back as long as it was not defeated. So this ability is essentially a reflect. It reflects certain damage dealt by adjacent units, but of course, as always, the devil in details, because if you look closely at the wording, which says when the unit is dealt damage, which as we already established is not the same as when the unit is taken damage. So just let me give an example. Let's say we have this Orc Adventurer is engaging and targeting this Khajiit Cutthroat, and let's say they rolled just a simple combat die. And of course a single bit of damage is not enough to go through this Khajiit Cutthroat defense of 3, so Khajiit Cutthroat would be taking no damage. However, this Orc would still take 3 damage back, because Khajiit Cutthroat has a Riposte 3, because it dealt damage. So again, this terminology, when you deal in damage or when some other units taking damage, is really important for skills like Retreat or especially this one, Riposte. So the absolutely worst thing you can do against those Riposte enemies, if you are melee characters, is dealing just a lot of little damage here and there, because this way you can attack back a lot of those kind of reflected damage back. So the easiest way to deal with them is simply either not be adjacent to them, just use your ranged attacks if you can, of course, but if you cannot, then try to at least defeat them with 1 go or with a minimum number of with engages and different attacks. Next we have Ritual, which says at the end of this unit's turn, all allied units inside heal for X health. The most important thing you need to know about this ability, and frankly that was my own beginner's mistake, because units are not considered allies of themselves, which means they won't be healing themselves with this ability. And this is obviously hugely important, especially when you deal with this enemy, because it has Ethereal and Ritual 3, which is just was a bit mind-boggling when I first encountered this enemy, thinking that it will heal itself for 3 health every turn, which it was just ridiculously overpowered. But yeah, thankfully they don't heal themselves, only all other allies. On a little side note, there are only 4 enemies with this ability, with 2 of them sharing the same chip, so this is why I can't show you all 4 enemies at once. And interestingly enough, they have the Ritual 1, Ritual 3 and the Ritual 4. So there is no Ritual 2 in this game. I'm not sure if it's like a little oversight or if they plan to add more Ritual 2 in the future expansions, but yeah, just a fun little observation. Overall, I would say this Ritual maybe not as nearly as bad as some other enemy skills, however it certainly can make things a bit more challenging for you, especially if you combine it with some other enemies on the battlefield, maybe with Divert ability or with Stalwart, which we'll get in a moment soon. But yeah, it can make things definitely more challenging for you, so even though I'm not considering Ritual enemies my top priority targets, I would still consider them pretty high on my priority list. Next we have Rot, which says after this unit is defeated by an adventurer, that adventurer gains 1 over fatigue. Those over fatigue in your cooldown track can be quite problematic, especially if you have several of them. I had one instance where I had all those 4 exact monsters, all those enemies deployed in a dungeon, and once I defeated all of them, I've got 4 over fatigue, and without a way of removing any fatigue from my cooldown track, as soon as the fatigue round kicked in on the round 6, I instantly took 5 true damage, and that was the end of my campaign. So yeah, over fatigue is quite nasty, especially if you're playing on expert difficulty, because you can't remove them essentially for free. You need to discard an item in order to activate the adventure rest step, which sometimes you don't have an item, and yeah, those over fatigues are really nasty. Probably the best way of avoiding gaining over fatigue from encountering with those enemies is using your companions or some kind of quest allies. Maybe if you have companions that you can summon, because when they defeat those enemies, they not gain over fatigue. It only applies to adventurers, so that's kind of one way. And another way would be using Intimidating Presence skill dice from the speech skill line, because this effect instantly removes enemy from the game, which is not the same as defeated, and hence why this Rot ability doesn't kick in. Although of course it's not gonna work on high level enemies. And probably the last way of getting around Rot is by using blind status die, because when enemies are blinded, they can attack. They treat all units as opposing units, and so when an enemy is defeated by another enemy, they're not getting over fatigue. So yeah, that's kind of another way of getting around it. But other than that, I would say Rot is pretty nasty, and you should be mindful, and maybe if you're playing with multiple adventurers, try to kind of split those over fatigue between different adventurers, or maybe keep some item in your backpack that maybe can remove fatigue from your cooldown track. This might come really handy. Next we have Rush, which says if this unit cannot target an opposing unit after its movement, it moves a second time instead. To be honest, I think this wording is not particularly clear, especially this part of instead of what, instead of just wasting their turn, instead of what. I think this really isn't clear, unfortunately, but thankfully we now have an official clarification that it means instead of engaging. So let's say we have a Wood Elf adventurer sitting over here, and we have this big beast is trying to reach it using movement 1, 2. That would be normally the end of a normal movement, but because it has a rush, it moves again, but it's, even though despite it's now within reach, it's not gonna engage. And this honestly was not clear to me. Up until I read this clarification, I always played that they move twice and then still attack, but apparently this word instead means that it instead of engage. So apparently this enemy skill rush isn't as bad as I personally thought, because all it does is basically just making those enemies move a little further than normally all other enemies would go, but yeah, other than that, they don't engage the same round, so yeah, it's definitely not the worst one. And speaking of the worst abilities, we have Shatter, which says each turn, the first time this unit is engaged by an adventurer who is not overtaxing a weapon, that adventurer must discard a weapon from a ready slot after they engage. So let's say we have this Wood Elf archer engaging those enemies in ranged battle form, following snipe dice, and these are the 2 weapons they have in their ready slot. And in this particular case, it means we need to either overtax the bow, because that is the only weapon we can use with this particular engage because of the Battlefall requirements, or we need to discard another weapon, which in this case is Void Steel Axe. Honestly, if you care about your weapons and you don't want to overtax and discard them, as soon as you see that those enemies they deployed, when you deployed, remember that you have a chance to move your items from your ready slots to your pack, so maybe use this opportunity to save your weapons, because otherwise you will have to discard them, which is, yeah, it's kind of pretty sad sometimes. Now obviously if you are playing Breton, their racial ability is really strong, because instead of discarding overtaxed item you can instead move it to your pack, so this is a kind of nice really walk around on this particular ability. But yeah, of course there's only one single race, and there are 9 other races that really hate those Shatter abilities. Another way of dealing with those Shatter enemies is by applying a fear status die, and honestly, whenever I have a fear in my disposal, maybe from a certain items, I generally trying to save them specifically for those Shatter enemies to kind of completely shut down those abilities. Remember that's how fear works. Just be mindful that when you're applying this fear, it doesn't have to be as part of the engage, so maybe from some certain items or maybe class abilities. For example, like the Acrobat class, they have the access to applying fear just as their class ability, and class abilities they don't count as engaged, so that's kind of another little workaround how to apply fear without engaging them, and hence why without overtax no discarding a weapon. But of course there is even a simpler solution, and that is by not having any weapons into your ready slot at all. So yeah, if you don't have a weapon, if you just started out, maybe that is not a big problem. But yeah, I would say this the Shatter enemy, they get a little bit more troublesome towards the late game once you already found that synergistic item, and you definitely don't want to lose it. This can be a little bit troublesome, but yeah, other than that, if you're just in the beginning of the game, you don't have any weapons to lose, then yeah, if you have nothing to lose, that maybe it's not a big deal. Moving on, next we have Siphon. At the end of this unit's turn, remove 1 health from each non-quest unit within range. Place all health removed under this unit's chip, which may exceed health stat. And first of all, let's clarify a couple of things about this ability. For example, that it only applies to each other non-quest unity within range. I've seen a couple of playthroughs where people were playing in a way that those Siphon enemies, they remove chips under themselves, effectively defeating themselves if they sit in with the last health chips, but no. I know the wording may be not precisely clear, and I wish it would include the word other, but yeah, that's at least the intent design of how this ability is supposed to be played. And also, most importantly, keep in mind that removing health is not damage, strictly speaking, which means that all damage preventing items and effects and skill lines like heavy armor or acrobatics or racial ability like Argonian resistance, they simply don't protect from this Siphon ability, which makes it so powerful. Because this ability works within units range, it means the more range they have, the more potentially health chips they're gonna kind of suck in from all other enemies under their own health chips. So for example, this Breton Archmage, it has a range of 5, which is the longest range out of all the Siphon enemies. It means it's potentially the scariest enemy, simply because it can cover the entire clash map, or even potentially even more than that if you encounter this enemy in a dungeon or some other layout with a more range than 5. So yeah, it can potentially suck in like even 10 or whatever enemies around you have that many chips under this one. So yeah, it's really dangerous, although I must say that sometimes it gets a little bit ridiculously hilarious, just the amount of health under this character you might encounter. Sometimes get, such a huge toll stack. So yeah, this is pretty hilarious sometimes, but obviously very strong and dangerous ability. The question I had is how this ability interacts with blindness. So let's say we have our adventurer, and let's say they applied a blind status die on this Breton Archmage, and let's say there are no other enemies around. And because this enemy is now blinded, it can only target strongest adjacent unit, so even though it has a range 5, it has to move adjacent, so it will come close in order to attack. However, this Siphon ability still will work with a range of 5, so it's full normal range, it doesn't restrict it by blindness in any way, so yeah, this unfortunately doesn't help much. And honestly, I think Siphon is probably the most dangerous enemy skill, simply because if you leave them unattended, if you kinda leave them as they go, they can just accumulate a huge toll stack of health, and which you be kinda hard time dealing with if you keep it like that. So yeah, definitely make them your priority targets if you can. Up next we have everyone's favorite Stalwart. This unit cannot lose more than 1 health in a single turn. And the way specifically it's worded is that those units, they can't lose health, which means it's not exactly the same as damage prevention, which means even through damage it doesn't kind of bypass this effect. Those enemies, they still can't lose more than 1 health in a single turn, no matter what. And this is kind of the ultimate protection against being one-shotted. Kind of similar to Divert, but even above that level. But thankfully, because this limit applies only to a single turn and not a combat round, it means, let's say, if you have multiple adventurers, they all focusing on this single enemy, it means this enemy can lose up to 3 health in this case for a single combat round. So while those units, they can't lose more than 1 health in each individual's turns, they still can collectively lose more health in a round in total. But of course, this makes things a little bit easier when you're playing with multiple adventurers, but on the contrary, it makes things much tougher when you are playing solo. So let's say if we have this only one single Wood Elf Archer against those enemies, that means you effectively would need that much rounds in order to defeat that much health. So we have 5, 4, or 3 in this case. Yeah, it may take quite a while to defeat those enemies. This Breton Usurper is particularly dangerous because it deploys with additional health equal to the number of trained combat dice. And remember that we talked about this Colossal skill before, so it will deploy with potentially from 2 to up to 10 extra health, again depending on how many combat dice you have. So yeah, this might be really dangerous. Honestly, the best ways of dealing with the Stalwart enemies are our old friends Executioner from Two-Handed skill line, Destructive Touch from Destruction Staff skill line, and Intimidating Presence from the Speech skill line. Because those effects, they not deal in damage, so that means those enemies, they not losing health, and effectively they can just instantly remove or defeat them, yeah, with just with 1 die. Which is why those dice particularly super strong and useful to have in your toolkit against those enemies, because you're gonna encounter them pretty frequently. But beyond those 3 dice, there are a couple of more options that might help you to defeat Stalwart enemy a little bit quicker, particularly in solo. First of all is applying a Bane status die. Because this Bane is applies on their turn, that effectively doubles the rate in which you deal in damage to this enemy, 1 from your turn and 1 on this unit's turn. And the same goes with Immovable and Defensive Posture from Heavy Armor and One Hand and Shield skill lines, because those dice, they effectively reflect a portion of the damage back to those enemy, and that happens on their turn. Though keep in mind that those 2 dice, they're not gonna stack alongside the Bane, because yeah, just only one of them can work on their turn. So while those enemies are not particularly dangerous on their own, the real threat comes of course from the simple time and the amount of time that it takes to get rid of them, because as you probably know, especially in delves or some endgame dungeons, the most threatening thing is your combat round, because once you start taking over fatigue damage starting on round 6, yeah, it's really hard to deal with this for a long time. So yeah. Next we have Steal. When this unit determines a target, roll 1d6. If the result is greater than or equal to the target's current health, the target discards a non-consumable item from a ready slot. Now, it's worth noting that all of those Steal enemies, all those bandits and marauders, they are all part of the general enemy set, which means you're gonna encounter them a lot regardless of which region you are playing. And the less health you currently have, the more likely then some of those enemies will steal items from you, which sometimes might be really unfortunate if you found some really nice items synergistic with your build, some particular weapon or armor, especially some legendary items. Yeah, this can be devastating losing those items. The best way of dealing with this kind of enemies is training your health stat at least up to 7, because once you're sitting at 7 health, you are effectively becomes immune to this effect, because there is simply not possible to roll greater or equal to 7 on a d6 roll. Of course, keep in mind that for the purpose of this effect, it counts your current health, not your total health, and of course your bonus health doesn't count as well. But as long as you are sitting at your max health and your max health stat is at least 7, you are safe. Overall, I think these enemies are balanced pretty nicely. They're not the most dangerous enemy when it comes to dealing damage or things like that, but this steal effect can be pretty nasty. So yeah, I think it's kind of very nice thematic, all those bandits and marauders that you encountering on the road, on your travels. Yeah, I think it works pretty nicely. Not the most dangerous enemies, but also at the same time, don't try to keep them for a very long time, because once you get your current health below 7, then you might be a little bit in trouble. Next we have Vinesnare, which says after this unit's engage, its target must drain one available combat skill die. Now as you already know, the combat skill die are referred to this specific white dice that every adventurer starts with. And because this ability says it works only on available combat skill dice, and available means that these dice, they sit in your attribute row in your adventure mat and they are ready to roll, so that means this ability doesn't work if the skill dice already in your cooldown track or sitting in your active slots. Overall, I would say this is a pretty harmless effect compared to some other effects in this game. And even if you look at those enemies, they definitely pretty dangerous, but definitely not because of the Vinesnare effect. For example, this Lamia, as we already established, this Enfeeble 5 can be absolutely devastating, or this Wood Elf Dada is a pretty strong enemy, but simply because of the fact that they have range 6 and they roll 4 combat dice. And yeah, it's the same thing for other enemies. I think Vinesnare is definitely not the worst skill that you can encounter. Of course, if your build heavily relies on rolling those combat dice, that still can be pretty nasty. For example, if maybe you have some items that are synergistic with rolling specifically those combat dice, or maybe you play in a Dragon Knight and you want to use your Molten Weapons ability to roll combat dice to deal true damage. So yeah, there are some effects where you can rely on combat dice specifically, and this can be a little bit problematic, but yeah, other than that, I think this is a pretty, not the most threatening ability overall. Now let's talk about native skills, which work differently depending on the region, on the province you are playing. But before doing that, I want to take in this opportunity just to say how much I appreciate it, how much I love this design. I think it's such a clever way. It's essentially a flexible modifier that allows to change monsters' enemies' behavior depending on the region, and especially if you think about new upcoming expansions with at least 3 more regions, that this native keyword, this native ability allows all of those existing enemies behave a little bit differently in all those regions. Yeah, it's just such a clever design. I absolutely love it. Now let's talk about province-specific effects of the enemy skills, starting with Black Marsh, which is called Storm Seer. When this unit determines a target, its target must exhaust a number of dice from its active slots as determined by the current weather. When it's sunny, it's 1, when it's rainy, it's 2, and when it's flooding, it's 3. This skill effectively works the same way as Disrupt, but a kinda more upgraded version, or kinda slightly worse version, and depending how you look at this, depending on the weather in the province. Similarly to Disrupt, this skill can be quite problematic if you're heavily relying on certain dice sitting in your active slots, for example, like One Hand in a Shield, or Restoring Light, or Light Armor. And remember that this effect takes place as soon as the unit determines a target, so it doesn't even need to hit or deal damage, or even before rolling the dice, so it means you don't have a chance to react with your, for example, One Hand and a Shield to prevent damage. So yeah, overall this can be quite problematic if you rely on certain skill lines, but other than that, if you don't use those specific skill lines, I think you are safe. You probably won't even notice this ability that much. Moving on to the next province, we have Cyrodiil and the enemy native skill called Detain. When this unit determines a target, its target must exhaust an available skill die. If the Empire Remnant is dominant, the skill is drained instead. So the way this skill works is kind of pretty similar to Black Marsh in a way that it works as soon as the unit determines a target. You need to either exhaust or drain a skill die, or maybe similar to Vinesnare when you need to drain a combat skill die. Remember that the word available only refers to the dice that sit in your adventure mat, specifically in your attribute rows, not in the cooldown track and not in active slots. I think when you are encountering native enemies in Cyrodiil, it's best to keep at least 1 combat die sitting in your attribute slots available, so you could exhaust or drain this one instead of some other maybe more important skill dice. Overall, I think this Detain enemy skill is quite dangerous, especially when Empire Remnant is dominant, and keep in mind that it is dominant by default before some other alliances took place as dominant factions in this region. But yeah, if you have multiple those native enemies in a single battle, you're gonna drain a lot of dice, and unless you have some certain ways of recovering drained dice, maybe using some class abilities or certain items, this can be really problematic. And frankly, for this reason, I would probably rate this Cyrodiil enemy skill the most dangerous out of all provinces. Moving on to the next province, High Rock, we have the enemy skill Incite. After this unit is defeated, all allied units heal for health equal to the current unrest. And even though generally speaking you want to try to keep your unrest track at the minimum, there are certain quests that ask you to keep it up to the top, keep it up to dangerous or even chaotic. So yeah, you inevitably will encounter with these native enemies sometimes on this unrest track at the pretty high value. And I think this turns battles into a very interesting, a kind of very different puzzle in a way, because you want to make sure that all those native enemies, you either defeat them first or maybe defeat them last instead, because you definitely don't want to deal deal some damage to some other enemies, then defeat those native enemies because this will heal all the rest. Yeah, it just turns into a completely different puzzle, and I love it. And as already mentioned, probably the best way of dealing with this particular Incite skill is to either defeating those enemies first or very last, again, depending on how threatening some other skills on particular enemies you encounter. But yeah, generally speaking, maybe try to focus them first, especially if you are sitting at a pretty high unrest value. Next we have Morrowind and the enemy skill Fumes. After this unit is engaged by an opposing unit, apply a blind status die to the opposing unit. So basically, as soon as you hit all those native enemies in Morrowind, you get blinded. This can be quite tough to deal with, especially if you're playing a ranged character, particularly with the bow skill line. Because remember, in order to roll dice for you engage with the bow skill line, you need to be in a ranged battle form. However, while you are in ranged battle form, you can't target adjacent enemies. While you are blinded, it's the other way around, you can target only adjacent enemies. So there's like a little anti-synergy going on. You want to be adjacent in order to deal some damage while you're blinded, but you can't do that with the bow skill line. So yeah, this can be pretty tricky to deal with, especially for those type of characters. One of the ways, and frankly maybe the best way of dealing with those kind of enemies, is defeating them in one go, essentially just instantly defeating them in a single engage. Because if this enemy is defeated, you're not gonna gain this status die, which I think is maybe not so obvious, but that's at least how it works. And I should also mention that it works the same for the Chilblain enemy skill that we already covered earlier. I think these Fumes and Chilblains, it's like those enemies, they reacting back to your attack, to your engage, but if you are defeating them, those enemies defeated, they can no longer react to your engage, and hence why those Fumes and Chilblain, they don't work against you. So yeah, honestly, the best course of action against those Fumes enemies, try to defeat them in one go, in a single engage. This way you're not gonna trigger their Fumes ability, but other than that, they can be pretty nasty. Next we have Skyrim, and this enemy skill works exactly the same in both parts of this region, in Western and Eastern Skyrim, and it's called Freeze. When this unit determines a target, its target must move one item from a ready slot to their pack. If the party is currently in Under Siege town, the target must move all items to their pack. So essentially, when those freezing enemies target you, you must essentially lose the item for the given battle, moving them from your ready slot to your pack. And because this effect triggers as soon as they determine the target, you don't even have a chance to react with some of your armor maybe that would normally be able to prevent damage, but yeah, you have to move your item even before they deal damage. Of course, if your pack is already full and you're moving some items, which means you need to discard an item, which is the worst part of this ability, especially when the town is under a siege. That means you must move all of your items from the pack and you potentially discarding up to 4 items, which might be just a huge loss for your build. Generally speaking, I would advise keeping at least some slots available in your pack so you could move items freely between your ready slot to your pack without discarding an item. This might be the best course of action. However, of course, if you're dealing with those enemies while in the siege, this is a bit more challenging. You're very unlikely gonna have 4 items in your pack. So yeah, in that case, just focus on these enemies early on before they will have a chance to move all of your items, potentially losing all of your items. And this of course gets even worse when you're dealing with a combination of native and Stalwart, like this little spider. Oh, one of the worst enemies in the entire game really, depending on the region. But yeah, in this particular province, if you're playing in solo and you don't have some ways of dealing extra damage, like applying a Bane status die, it means you need to potentially deal with this enemy for 5 turns, for 5 combat rounds, and that means they will attack for that many rounds, and that means you need to move that many items from your pack and potentially discarding some items. Yeah, that might be a bit crucial. And at last but not least, we have Valenwood and the enemy skill called Iron Bark. When this unit is dealt damage by non-adjacent units, its defense is increased by 1 for that engage. So essentially, if you are attacking those enemies from the distance, maybe with your bow skill line or maybe with some magic spells, you essentially can add in 1 extra defense to their printed value. So for example, this Wood Elf Stalker would have 3 defense, and this Storm Atrenak would have 4 defense against this particular attack. I would say, generally speaking, it's slightly easier to play a ranged character in this game compared to melee characters, for various reasons, from delves to just normal combos to certain encounters, and I guess this Iron Bark ability is kind of made in a way to balance this, as well as the Morrowind ability. Fumes in Morrowind, they both kind of make ranged characters' life slightly tougher, which I guess balance things out in a way. But yeah, overall, frankly, Actually, I would say this is the most boring ability out of all those native skills. But yeah, other than that, there is not much to say about this ability. Of course, if you can try to deal damage adjacent to those enemies, this way you're not gonna deal with the 1 extra defense. But if you're playing a bow character, there is not much you can do anyway. You're just dealing with 1 extra defense to pierce through. But yeah, other than that, there's not much else you can do about it. And that's it for the enemy skills breakdown. I might do a separate video covering all quest enemies, but let me know if you actually want to see that. If you found it helpful, liking the video and subscribing really helps the channel grow. And if you want to support the channel directly, you can do this over on Patreon, and I would appreciate this a lot as well. And well, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.